Hello, viewers. This is Kamar Shima, and I'm thrilled to have with me Ms. Elizabeth Trelkel. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your time.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Elizabeth is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. She has been doing a lot of work before joining Stimson. She was working for the State Department. So today I requested Elizabeth to talk. To talk about the developments in South Asia. So, my first question to you is that most recently there has been a discussion going on that somewhere the strategic stability in South Asia has got compromised because India is getting a lot of weapons. India is buying a lot of weapons, and India's defense budget has increased 13%. Do you think this is because of the rising Chinese threat? What do you make of this, please?
Yeah, I think when we look at South Asia as a region, I actually prefer to think of it in terms of Southern Asia, right? Which is a term which includes China in the mix, which is so central in this new era of geostrategic competition that we've entered in. With the US China rivalry, primarily, we're seeing, based on US government reports, a real significant modernization drive within China in terms of its nuclear program, its numbers of weapons, but also capabilities, building out more advanced systems. And China itself is doubling down on its own defense budget. And so when you think about the idea of what's called the strategic chain, right? That China responds to the US, India responds to China, Pakistan responds to India, you can see those second order impacts of that competition on down throughout the region. Of course, that's not the whole story, right? There is this dyadic rivalry between India and Pakistan, also between India and China, as we saw with the border clashes along the line of actual control back in 2020, but continuing on until recent months. And then, of course, with the Indo Pacific strategy and the way that geostrategic alignments have taken hold in the region, we have a deepening US India partnership as well as a very strong China Pakistan partnership. And so I don't know what the right metaphor is. It's not three-dimensional chess, but taking all of those factors in mind, I think is really important because sitting in Pakistan, I can understand how, seeing an India that is focused on modernization and is doubling down on its defense budget would come across as threatening. But I was recently in Delhi in January, and I have to tell you that all of the conversation was about China. Minds are focused on the northern border, and so I think that's our challenge to try to disaggregate and better understand threat perceptions on all sides to get a sense really of where the situation is in terms of regional strategic stability these days.
So, Elizabeth, how do you see this Chinese assertiveness for the in the region? Do you think that, for example, the Chinese are calling Quad as a Asian NATO, and on the other hand, for example, just recently the new Chinese foreign minister just said that Indo-Pacific strategies will fail. So, but at the same time, they are there in South China Sea. They are assertive. They are getting tough with the regional with the regional countries. How do you see Chinese assertiveness when the Chinese are also being blamed for their debt trap diplomacy? But overall, how do you see its assertiveness in the region?
Yeah, I think, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who just gained his third term, I think we've seen progressively more assertiveness over time from China, and I see no signs of that letting up. Um, Certainly, you mentioned the quote unquote debt trap diplomacy, the efforts through the Belt and Road Initiative. Some regional countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and beyond are feeling the effects of that now, even if it has brought some infrastructure benefits, as well as militarily. We've seen in the South China Sea, China expanding its presence through these islands that they have built up with airstrips and military capabilities. But it's not just kind of overt military preparation, you also have to look at gray zone tactics. The idea of the maritime militia, which allows China more access in the sea. It's really across the board that we're seeing this increase in Chinese assertiveness. And of course, as you rightly point out, that has caught the attention not just of Washington, but of allies and partners around the world, and led to um, a growing focus on how we can understand the trajectory of the Chinese and what needs to be done in response in order to protect the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific that is at the core of the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy.
So, Elizabeth, just in the first question, you said that in India, everybody's talking about China. But I was just looking recently that Pakistan's Minister for State, Hina Rabani Kar, gave a statement that India is a net recipient of the generous supplies of advanced conventional and non-conventional weapons technologies and platforms. So, what you are making that the India is thinking about China. Do you think that South Asia is getting a little irrelevant in the global politics? Because, for example, if India is being looked from the Chinese lens and not from a Pakistan's lens, so where do you see the South Asia as a region? Because it seems that the Pakistani concerns are obviously not being addressed, or Pakistan's concerns are not there. Do you think that the South Asia as a region does not have that value because India is linked more towards Indo-Pacific? So uh, South Asia is just Pakistan because everybody has become part of the Indo-Pacific, be it Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, Nepal. So how do you see this thought that South Asia as a region doesn't have doesn't have global value for the great powers, and Hina Rabani's point of view as well?
Hmm. Yeah, as I was kind of alluding to in my first answer, I think the way that I come at this question is expanding the idea of what is South Asia, right? How do we draw the boundaries around these geographies, and thinking about the region a little bit more expansively to include China in this idea of Southern Asia. To my mind, that's a more accurate rendering of how the region relates to the broader international order, to geostrategic competition these days. Because just as India and the US have deepened their partnership over the last few years, I think the China-Pakistan partnership is quite significant in that. And so it's important to bear in mind those benefits and perhaps challenges as well that Pakistan is on the receiving end of from China through that partnership, because it's very much a part of this conversation. So in trying to grapple with, it feels a little bit like a maze sometimes of trying to understand who's who's looking where, and where the threat perceptions are, and where we all need to be focusing. I think all the more important from my perspective to sit down and talk to each other and have candid conversations about where those threat perceptions lie, where perhaps new dynamics are coming out in ways that we haven't anticipated. So one area we tend to think, I think, mostly about continental South Asia or Southern Asia, but it's really in the maritime domain where I think looking forward we should be focusing, because we have uh, first of all, no region that includes three nuclear armed powers is ever going to be irrelevant internationally. So important to bear that in mind. But I think it's in the maritime domain that competition really has the potential to materialize over the coming years, as we have Pakistan, India, and China increasingly sending nuclear weapons to sea, and kind of the risks that could come from that with increased maritime and naval competition. So I don't think that South Asia is in and of itself becoming isolated. I think it's more just a call to perhaps reframe how we understand the region as it fits into the current geopolitical moment.
So, Elizabeth, how do you see that just recently in February, just last month, India and Pakistan completed 2 years of, ceasefire the 2003 agreement, which was has formally been formalized between India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
Nobody celebrated. I was the one who raised the voice that we should celebrate. This is a
Yeah.
moment. But do you think that this is too little to celebrate, because nothing more has been done after that? And many people in Pakistan believe that okay, India did this 2000, India did this ceasefire agreement because India didn't want to give a message to the international community that okay, things are not bad at LOC and LAC at the same time. But at home, domestically, the politicians are saying that there is a two-front war. But on the other hand, they have achieved this that there is no the things are calmed at LOC. So how do you see this LOC thing, which this agreement, and do you think that this is too little for the animosity between, looking at the animosity or the level of the jingoism or the belligerence both countries had over the years?
I think it is an accomplishment to be celebrating. I was celebrating with you in spirit here in DC, I have to say. And it is perhaps for the best, given where the relationship stands right now, that the LOC ceasefire is not in the news, has not gotten a great deal of attention, right? It is certainly not sufficient to manage tensions between both sides. I very much hope that it is something that can be built on going forward. But I'm really cognizant of everything that both Pakistan and India have on their plate these days. In Pakistan, I don't need to tell you about the poly crisis, as it's been termed, that the country is facing in terms of politics, economics, security, climate, you name it. There's a lot going on. In India, similarly, as I mentioned, there's so much focus on China, but also on its role hosting the G20, the SCO. There's just a lot on our collective plates right now. And so, to my mind, that is all the more reason to not invite additional problems, right? So, this has been in place. It was re-agreed. It came as a surprise to me and a reassuring one to an extent, right? That back channel talks had actually led to this recommitment to the 2003 agreement. The fact that it's been ongoing for 2 years is really significant. And looking at the trajectory of the two countries over the next couple of years, we expect Pakistan will eventually, sooner or later, go for elections sometime this year. India is next year. And so, in the focus that I expect to kind of take hold on the domestic political scene, it seems like it's in the best interest of both countries to continue keeping things quiet on the LOC, focus inward, and then see where we get if we do have governments that come to power in both sides, whomever is at the helm, to then try to take that relationship forward rather than pushing for something now or potentially compromising this 2 year success that we do have to show.
So, how, Elizabeth, the next question is that how US sees the region with the US withdrawal and the rise of China, and particularly these recent developments where China has brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So, the Americans have left the region, the Chinese are there. And I remember, I think. The American administration's attention is more towards Indo-Pacific, but do you think that this withdrawal from the Afghanistan, the Chinese, how they have managed things in West Asia, what do you make of these developments?
I think to start, I would push back a little bit on the notion that the US has fully left the region and China is there. I don't think it is that sort of clean replacement in any sense. Looking at Afghanistan specifically, certainly post US withdrawal, the US presence is much less than it used to be. But similarly, I remember having conversations with friends in Pakistan in the run up to that withdrawal, and they were predicting and kind of warning that as soon as the US was going to leave, Beijing was going to come in and start mining for all the minerals and take advantage of the situation. And I think it's been striking the extent to which that really hasn't happened. We've seen one recommitment to a 12-year-old mining agreement and not much else in terms of Chinese involvement. as you say, the Iran-Saudi deal was significant. I don't follow the Middle East as closely, and so I can't comment on the specifics of it. But China is a player, and if this is a new center of gravity in terms of international diplomacy, it seems like it's much more from a perspective of economics, kind of purported Chinese non-interference, all of that. It's something to watch going forward. But in terms of South Asia as a region, right, as I was laying out earlier, we see deep investments through the Indo-Pacific strategy across the region, not just in India, but more broadly. And I think China as well is similarly dug in and invested and has been for some time. So I think we are certainly at a moment of flux, but perhaps a little bit too soon to, identify those takeaways from the deal specifically and how they might reflect back on South Asia as a region.
So, Elizabeth, just recently I was looking at news that there is an India-based defense company, Brahmos Aerospace, which is India and Russia's joint venture, and they're selling somewhere, supersonic cruise missiles to Indonesia for worth $200 million. On the other hand, we have seen that India acquired S-400, and we have seen the third squadron of S-400 has reached India. At the same time, Americans, they had to, they didn't impose sanctions on India under CARSA. So, what Washington makes out of this, with they're getting weapons from Russia, and they are selling weapons with the support of the Russia to many countries in Southeast Asia. So, what's like how will Washington look at that? Betting on India for the region.
Yeah, I mean, it is a difficult moment in many ways. And I think the war in Ukraine has exposed some of the divergences in the US and Indian approach to thinking about questions of sovereignty, but also where to focus, right? So, talking to colleagues in India, the point that you hear most often is that India is still a regional power. It's based in the Indian Ocean, its focus is on China, on the Indo Pacific. And it doesn't bring much value if it were to, line up with the U.S. and like-mindeds on the war in Ukraine. It's trying to stake out still its strategic autonomy. And from the U.S. perspective, there is this idea of respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and a clear linkage between the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater. And I think that's perhaps where there is a point of distinction. In Washington, there's a special concern about the growing, quote unquote, no limits partnership between Russia and China, and where that might lead, particularly if in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, Russia emerges weaker and potentially more dependent on China and subject to Chinese pressure. And so, from India's perspective, as seen here in Washington, that could be really problematic if India finds itself in a militarized crisis along the line of actual control, and Russia, the source of much of its weaponry, its traditional partner, comes under pressure from the Chinese to perhaps delay support. We actually saw something similar play out in the 1962 war, in the interest of keeping the Chinese side on side during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, from Washington's perspective, there are concerns there, but it's also, I think, to my mind, a demonstration of the growing maturity of the U.S.-India partnership, that we've been able to have those conversations in private, but also move past them and not let that derail the progress that's being made more broadly in the relationship. On the question of third-party missile sales, this is a tough one, right? So Washington kind of has two interests here. One is building out India's defense industrial base. India is, as you know, is looking to make in India to really become its own source of weaponry. So it doesn't have to be dependent on Russia or the US or anyone else. And that really requires investments at home in terms of the defense industrial base that have been lacking over the last several decades. And so third-party sales could provide a way of encouraging that investment, getting the number of orders that are required to really create those supply chains within India. So that's one side of it. Of course, the Russia connection, it's troubling. The BrahMos missile that you were mentioning, it's the Brahmaputra and the Moscow. That's where the name comes from. And I think we can't ignore that and need to get a sense of what those implications could be. But by the same token, I think at the moment, the approach seems to be kind of watch and wait and try to balance those two objectives that find themselves in competition in that specific example.
Yes, obviously, it seems a challenge. But one quick last question is that just recently the IEA chief was in Pakistan, and he said that Pakistan's he appreciated Pakistan's safeguards record. But very recently, the U.S. Commerce Department has put some of the Pakistani firms in the entity list, allegedly for contributing to the ballistic missile program of concern. But at the same time, there's a lot of support which is going to India. So Pakistan has been saying for long that there is a preferential treatment. Do you think that this is Pakistan's back track record because of the AQ Khan episode, or this is the financial issues which Pakistan is facing? That's why Pakistan cannot have that technology, and much of that is going to India, and Pakistan is just the IEA appreciates Pakistan, but the Americans. They have come up, blacklisting Pakistani firms. How do you see this? Did you see that news?
I did see that news. And I think here it's really important to disaggregate a little bit, right? So the conversations with the IAEA were very much on the civilian nuclear side, right? So that's one side of the equation. The entities listing was on the military side of the nuclear program. And it certainly wasn't limited to Pakistan. This is something that is a regular practice run by the Commerce Department. It comes out, I think the most recent one was in December 2022. And it basically says that it's not in the U.S. national interest for these potentially dual use parts to go to systems that we think are being used for contributing to a nuclear weapons program. That I saw then, I think it was in Dawn, an editorial that was trying to draw connections between the economic crisis and the IMF and all this. Like, I would really push back on that framing. It is very specific to, this subset of technical issues. I do not think it has anything to do more broadly with the economic crisis, and really is on very technical concerns. Obviously, I don't have visibility on the specific companies, but just seeing the full listing and the description, it was some Chinese firms, some Pakistani firms, and then a range of others that were going to support Russian programs as well. So I think it can be easy to try to connect those dots when there's so much going on, and it feels like the U.S. is involved, but this really should be seen kind of in terms of a standalone issue.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth Threadgill, for your time and for helping us to understand some very pressing discussions and debates in South Asia. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, the recording.